In part 1 of this series, the idea of great replacement is described and defined, relying on formulations by Renaud Camus and others. In this part we start listing up the criticisms and counterarguments against the great replacement concept, and we face these with empirical evidence. The first kind of these criticisms attempts to downplay, minimize or relativize the demographic changes taking place in Europe, which could amount to native Europeans becoming a minority in their own countries. A recent article by Melissa Rossi is a good example of this approach. The article, which appeared on the 30th of June 2019 in Yahoo News, has a special focus on Martin Sellner, an Austrian identitarian activist, who states that a great replacement is indeed taking place. Rossi writes, Sellner views the great replacement as a mathematical fact, the result of cultural, political and economic decisions made over recent decades. Since the 60s and 70s, Europe's population, of indigenous white Europeans, has been shrinking, he says, largely because white European women, like their American counterparts, were not bearing the 2.1 children considered necessary to maintain a stable population. But Europe's population is rising, due to the influx of immigrants, or what he calls replacement migration. That part, statistics show, is true at least in some countries. The numbers of incoming immigrants have offset deaths in European nations, such as Germany and Sweden, leading to overall population growth. But the great replacement theory goes entirely off the rails when proponents, such as Sellner's group, assert, as they do on the Generation Identity website, that low birth rates of German and European people and simultaneous massive Muslim immigration will turn us into minorities in our own countries in a few decades, leading to the disappearance of Germans and Europeans in their own countries. As evidence for her rejection of Sellner's concept of the Great Replacement, Rossi quotes two academics. The first of them, demographer Landis Mckellar from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, wrote a review of Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission, criticizing the idea of a replacement of the French population by Muslims. He calls people who takes this idea seriously disparagingly as the little man who find the Great Replacement a gripping yarn. Then he continues, the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life, in collaboration with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, in Vienna, estimated that the Muslim share of the French population will grow from 7.5 to 10% between 2010 and 2030. That estimate is pre-refugee crisis, but France has made it clear that it will refuse to be the repository of significant numbers of asylum seekers. The other academic Rossi quotes, human geographer Aylen du Crow from the University of Leicester, questions what data the identitarian group is using to make such projections based on the unreliability of population statistics in France. She then tries to diminish the importance of the demographic change by saying, the reality is that Europe, in the largest sense, not just the EU, has always been a continent where people moved around a lot, she says. I would say that mobility, and thus intermixing, is what characterizes Europeans across time, not ethnicity. In addition to quoting these two academics, Rossi also refers to a report by the Pew Research Center, and she writes this. A report from the Pew Research Center released in late 2017, Europe's growing Muslim population, estimated the number of Muslims in Europe to be less than 5%. Even using the highest estimates for migration rates, the report estimated that in 2050, the number of Muslims continent-wide would be around 14%. This prediction is enough for Rossi to dismiss the Great Replacement theory altogether. She does quote Sellner, who says that if you just continue the trend, the population decline plus the replacement migration will lead to a total replacement. However, Rossi totally disregards this argument. The rest of her article is a warning about the dangers of believing in the Great Replacement theory. Rossi builds up a guilt by association by pointing to terrorists like Brenton Tarrant, to so-called hate groups, and to rightist politicians, all of whom refer to the Great Replacement. We will not discuss this second part of her article as it is not relevant for this video. Instead, let's start discussing the claims against the demographic reality of the Great Replacement, as they appear in Melissa Rossi's article. We shall examine the arguments made by Landis Mckellar, Aylen du Crow and Melissa Rossi herself. All three authors try to allay fears about the demographic changes predicted by the Great Replacement theory. Landis Mckellar reassures us, there is no need to worry, even by 2030 there will be only 10% Muslims in France. In any case, France decided not to accept too many refugees. Aylen du Crow tells us, there is no need to worry, there is nothing new here, there has always been lots of migration in Europe. And Melissa Rossi promises that there is no need to worry, as even by 2050 there will be maximally 14% Muslims in Europe. Mckellar wrote his article in 2015, during the year of the refugee crisis. He is aware that the Pew Research estimate about the Muslim percentage in 2030 he is referring to as pre-refugee crisis, as he writes. But this doesn't make him re-evaluate the Pew Research predictions and dismisses the chances of a great replacement in France as slim. We'll see a bit later in this video what a newer report by the same Pew Research Center predicts about Muslim demographics. In addition to the dismissive attitude towards the only 10% Muslims by 2030, Mckellar bases his confidence that there is nothing to worry about on the fact that France has made it clear that it will refuse to be the repository of significant numbers of asylum seekers. One wonders whether Mckellar is really so naive that he believes what he writes here. It is not France which makes any commitments about the numbers of refugees to be accepted, but the ruling government of France. The number of refugees accepted by France can radically change any time when the government or its policies change. This can happen, for example, under pressure from the EU or from the UN, whose global compact for migration France supported. Aylen du Crow, in essence, says, there is no need worrying about a great replacement in Europe. The demographic changes currently affecting Europe are nothing special, as Europe has always been a continent where people moved around a lot. It is not clear what kind of movements of people du Crow means. If she means military invasions, of these there were indeed many and they were mostly actively resisted by the country which was invaded. But if she means non-military, peaceful immigration, then du Crow's argument is not true. People in Europe did not always move around a lot. Taking Britain as an example, Douglas Murray writes this in his book The Strange Death of Europe, published in 2018. Until the latter half of the last century, Britain had almost negligible levels of immigration. The mass movement of people was almost unknown. In fact, immigration was so unknown that when it did happen people talked about it for centuries. Up until the 19th century there has been only one big wave of immigration into Britain, that of the Huguenots, French Protestants, in the late 17th century. 50,000 of them entered Britain, fleeing persecution in France. This corresponded to about 0.8% of the population of Great Britain, which was then about 6.5 million. There was much immigration from Ireland to England and to Scotland during the 19th century. Many of the immigrants were fleeing from the potato famine in Ireland during the 1840s. At the very top of the immigration, about 4% of the population of England, Scotland and Wales was Irish-born. After that, the proportion of the Irish-born decreased and by 1901 they constituted only 2% of the population. While the immigration of the Irish was indeed substantial, it was different from the immigration by Huguenots, as Ireland was part of Great Britain at that time. Immigration from Ireland was internal migration. The other large wave of immigration during the 19th century was by Jews. Between 1881 and 1900 about 100,000 Jews immigrated to England from Russia and Poland, fleeing persecution. Jewish immigration resulted in a growth from 0.2% to 0.59% of the Jewish population. To summarize, these waves of immigration between the 17th and 19th century, at the high points of immigration, resulted in the following percentages: Huguenots, 0.8%, Irish, 4%, Jews, 0.59%. Let's now see the development of the Muslim population in Britain, in comparison to the Jewish population. In the 20th century, the Jewish population increased further, both due to natural growth and to further immigration, in particular in the 1930s, because of the Nazi persecution of Jews in Europe. The demographic result of this Jewish immigration was that during the 60 years between 1880 and 1940, the Jewish population in Britain grew from 0.2% to 0.79%, a 4 times growth. Since then, the Jewish population decreased again, and it was 0.46% in 2001. In comparison, the Muslim population in England and Wales grew during a comparably long period, 56 years between 1961 and 2017, from 0.11% to 5.17%, making the Muslim population 47 times larger in 2017 than it was in 1961. This growth rate of an immigrant population is probably without precedent in British history, and comparable only to the growth of the Irish population in the mid-19th century, as a result of the potato famine. In addition to the pace of migration, current migration patterns to the UK differ in 3 other respects from historical migration, too. First, the 3 historical waves of immigration mentioned above were either Christians or Jews, which, despite differences, were much more compatible with British culture than the culture of Muslim immigrants who comprise much of the recent mass migration to Europe. Second, immigrants before the 20th century were mostly coming from different parts of Europe. Starting after World War II, many immigrants are coming from outside of Europe. Third, during all 3 historical migration waves mentioned above, Britain's native population was growing, during the 19th century even spectacularly. As the graph shows, during the 19th century the birth rate in the United Kingdom was almost always above 4 children per woman. That is, it was almost always more than twice the replacement level of 2. Thus, there was no danger at all that any of these 3 migration waves would threaten the native population's majority. In contrast, during the current migration wave, Britain's native population is shrinking, at the same time as the immigrant populations are growing both due to immigration itself and to higher birth rates. The graph shows that since 1980 the birth rate in the United Kingdom was below the replacement level of 2. The result is a continuously growing proportion of migrants in the population. This picture, from the Pew Research Centre's report about Europe's growing Muslim population, illustrates this fact. The picture shows data from 2016. It demonstrates the disparity between the age structures of Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe. The proportion of young people and children is far higher in the Muslim population, while the non-Muslim population has larger percentages of middle-aged and older people. One result is that London is now a city where people identifying themselves as white English are in the minority. Similar developments are ongoing in many other European cities, like Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Frankfurt am Main in Germany, and Vienna in Austria. There is now a research project at the Free University of Amsterdam with the title Becoming a Minority. The project, which is funded by the European Union, matter-of-factly assumes that indigenous Europeans will soon be in the minority in many European cities. The aim of the project is to understand how these people adapt to this new situation. The project's website shows that native Swedes are already in the minority in Malmö. Only 46% of the population of the city are native Swedes. In other words, 54% of the city's inhabitants are immigrants or descendants of them. The website also shows that only 33% of the young people in Antwerp, Belgium, are native Belgians. The pace and the extent of these developments are without precedent in European history. Thus the reassurances given to us by Aylen du Crow that there is nothing to worry about, that this has all happened before, as Europe has always been a continent where people moved around a lot, sound very hollow indeed. As mentioned before, Rossi refers to a report by Pew Research Centre from 2017 with the title Europe's Growing Muslim Population. She correctly quotes the current overall Muslim population in Europe to be less than 5%. The figure mentioned in the report is in fact 4.9%. She is also correct when she writes that according to Pew Research Center's highest estimates for migration rates, that the number of Muslims continent-wide would be around 14% by 2050. The Pew Research report defines Europe as the EU, plus Norway and Switzerland. 14% of Europe's population in 2050 will correspond to about 75.6 million people. An increase from 4.9% to 14% means that the Muslim population will almost triple during the 34 years between 2016 and 2050. This doesn't seem to worry Rossi much, so let's take a look at Pew Research Center's predictions in more detail. The graph, from the Pew Research Center's report, shows the three scenarios considered in the forecast. These scenarios differ from each other based on the assumption they make about future migration, zero migration, medium level of migration and high level of migration. It is already clear that migration to Europe continues, thus the zero migration scenario is unrealistic, and it will not be considered here. Medium migration is defined by the Pew Research Center as follows: regular migration continues and refugee flows cease. It is already clear that a medium level of migration, as defined like this, is not realistic, either. Though the extremely high numbers of refugees registered in 2015 are now not reported, and, at least in Germany, there is currently a downwards trend of asylum applications, refugee flows haven't ceased. Instead, they remain at high levels. The German Federal Center for Political Education writes this in April 2019. In 2018, 185,853 people applied for asylum in Germany. In the current year 2019, 46,477 initial or subsequent applications have so far, until the 28th of April 2019, been filed for asylum. Thus, we have to assume higher than medium levels of migration. High migration level is defined by the Pew Research Center as follows: 2014 to mid-2016 refugee inflow patterns continue, in addition to regular migration. Under this assumption, the European Muslim population will almost triple and will grow to 14% by 2050. Under this definition, the high migration scenario is not realistic either, as current migration levels don't reach the levels which were observed during the time between 2014 and 2016. Thus, it would seem that the most realistic scenario is between the medium and high migration levels, higher than the medium but lower than the high migration scenario. The picture on the right shows the percentages of the European Muslim population in 2050 for different countries, predicted by the Pew Research Center for the high migration scenario. Whether medium or high migration is assumed, it will not make much difference for the Muslim population percentages for some European countries. For example, for France, Pew Research Center predicts 17.4% with medium immigration and 18% with high immigration. For the UK, it predicts 16.7% for medium immigration and 17.2% for high immigration. Note one important thing, though, as the text underneath the picture on the left shows, none of the scenarios include asylum seekers who cannot expect to gain legal status to remain in Europe. This concerns hundreds of thousands of refugees. For example, in Germany in 2018 the majority of the asylum applications have been rejected. Thus, if asylum seekers appeared in Pew Research Center scenarios only under the condition that their asylum application was accepted, then hundreds of thousands of immigrants did not appear in those scenarios. As a consequence, all three of the scenarios underestimate the immigration to Europe. The developments of recent years, for example for Germany, show that very few of those whose asylum application is rejected leave Europe. In Germany, many of them receive a so-called tolerated status. But even if an attempt is made to deport them, this often fails because of many reasons. Many of them have thrown away their identification papers, so that it is not possible to determine their real country of origin. Others can't be deported because leftist politicians insist that their countries are unsafe. Again, others pretend to have medical problems which makes it impossible for them to fly in an airplane. Finally, many of these refugees simply disappear inside Germany, or they go to another European country before they can be deported. This is from an article published by the German newspaper Welt in 2018. According to the Central Register of Foreigners, about 618,000 people were living in the country at the turn of the year whose asylum application was finally rejected, most of them years ago. 78% of them are therefore already legalized, they are no longer obliged to leave. There are two additional things that should be considered. First, the Muslim population is not distributed evenly among European countries. The Muslim population in large Western and Northern European countries like Great Britain, France, Germany and Sweden will be quite a lot higher than the 14% average. In Eastern Europe and in much of Southern Europe the Muslim percentage will be below the average. The Western European countries are some of the economically, politically and culturally most important countries in Europe. Issues and problems related to the Muslim population in Europe already play a large part in the politics of these countries. It can be expected that 2 to 3 times larger Muslim populations, which these counties will have even according to the middle migration scenario, will increase the number of issues proportionally. Second, the Muslim population is not distributed evenly inside European countries. Instead, it tends to concentrate in larger cities like London, Birmingham, Paris, Berlin, Frankfurt am Main and Malmö. Thus, in these cities, the traditional historical, cultural, financial, economical and administrative centers of European countries, we can expect even higher Muslim population percentages than those predicted for the countries themselves. Sweden is a special case. Pew Research Center predicts that it will have the highest percentage of Muslims in Europe in 2050. In the high migration scenario, the percentage will be 30.6%, more than twice the European average. Before World War II, Sweden was an ethnically and culturally homogeneous country, with some small minorities. This changed dramatically a few decades after the war. Muslim immigration played an important role in that change. The Swedish case is interesting. In contrast to the United Kingdom and France, Sweden never had colonies in Muslim regions of the world. Also, it didn't have a large guest worker program, importing workers from Turkey, as Germany did. Remember the change of the Muslim population demographics in the UK? There, the Muslim population increased 47-fold between 1961 and 2017. Now check this graph. It shows that the Muslim population in Sweden became 810 times larger in 2017 than it was in 1960. As the graph shows, the growth started in the 1970s. It was the result of the country's multicultural and liberal immigration policies, adopted at first by the Social Democratic Party, and later by other parties, too. The country prides itself as a humanitarian superpower. As a result, it took in probably more refugees than any other European country, save Germany, during the 2015 refugee crisis. Though mass Muslim immigration is causing the most concern among Europeans, there is large-scale immigration to Europe from many other parts of the world, too. Here we shall describe recent demographic developments in Germany. Germany is an important country. It has the 4th largest economy in the world and the largest economy inside the EU. It is also the most populous country within the EU. Thus, whatever happens in Germany has wide-ranging repercussions for the EU but also for the whole world. Germany had a largely homogeneous population after World War II. Now it has a population, large segments of which have a migration background, many of whom are Muslims from Turkey, the Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan. Many others have a background in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia or in Europe, for example in Poland. This map shows the percentages of inhabitants with migration background in German federal states in 2017. In 2018, the German daily Tagesspiegel wrote this about the demographic situation in Germany. In Germany, the number of people with a migration background is increasing. As the Federal Statistical Office announced in Wiesbaden on Wednesday, 19.3 million women, men and children with foreign roots lived in the Federal Republic last year, which is 4.4% more than in the previous year. The share in the total population was 23.6%. Note that in Germany, migration background means that the person himself or at least one of his parents was born in a foreign country. Thus, a third-generation migrant, a person whose grandparents were born in a foreign country, does not count as somebody having a migration background anymore. He or she is counted simply as German. The proportion of people with migration background will definitely grow further. The current percentage of foreign children and children with migration background opens a window into Germany's demographic future. The left-hand graph shows the percentages of foreign children and those with migration background in different German federal states. Taking these two groups together, they already constitute more than 50% of all children in the city-state of Bremen, and nearly 50% in 3 other federal states. Indigenous German children are in these states already now in the minority or nearly in the minority. In the whole of Germany, the two groups together are 36.5% of all children. The right-hand graph shows the percentages of foreign children and those with migration background in communities of different sizes. In small communities, with less than 10,000 inhabitants, the percentage of these two groups together is about 20%. But in medium-sized cities, with 100,000 to 200,000 inhabitants, they are already in the majority. They constitute almost 50% in larger communities. The newspaper Tagesspiegel wrote in 2018, in Frankfurt am Main 55% in the age group 1 to 6 years have no German roots. In other major cities, such as Cologne, Munich, and Stuttgart, the proportion of the under 6-year-old children with migration background is more than 50%. In Berlin and Hamburg, it is just under 48% and 44%. These medium to large-sized German cities are the important centers of economic, political and cultural life in Germany. In a few decades, indigenous Germans will be in the minority in all of them. The main statement of the Great Replacement theory is that large-scale demographic changes are underway in Europe, and also in other Western countries. Indigenous European populations are gradually being replaced by people from other regions of the world, from the Middle East, from Africa and Asia. At some not too distant point in the future they will totally disappear and will be replaced by non-Europeans. Many people criticize this theory. In this video we considered the first type of criticism against the Great Replacement theory, which says that such replacement-level demographic changes are in fact not happening. Melissa Rossi says that, even by 2050, only about 14% of Europe's population will be Muslim, even in the most extreme scenario by Pew Research Center. This, according to her, is a reason to reject the Great Replacement theory. Rossi is building up two straw men here. First, she talks only about the role of Muslim immigration. But the Great Replacement theory does not say that European populations will be replaced by Muslims. It simply says that European populations will be replaced by non-Europeans, some or many of whom will be Muslims, but not necessarily all. Second, the Great Replacement theory doesn't say that Europeans will be replaced by non-Europeans by a specific date. Instead, it says that a Great Replacement is ongoing. It doesn't set some date by which it is supposed to conclude. The theory views population replacement as a gradual process, during which more and more of the European population is replaced. Thus, pointing to the prediction that by 2050 Muslims will constitute only 14% of the European population, as Melissa Rossi does, is not a valid argument against the Great Replacement theory. The real, relevant question is whether a gradual replacement of European populations by non-Europeans is ongoing or not. All the evidence looked at in this video shows that such a population replacement is in fact ongoing. The percentage of Muslim population of the United Kingdom became 47 times larger between 1961 and 2017. During the same period, it became 810 times larger in Sweden. According to the same scenario that Rossi considers, the 2017 Muslim population percentage in both countries will more than triple again during the next 20 years. The same growth is to be expected in other European countries, like France and Germany, too. In several big European cities, the native European population is either already in the minority, or will soon be in the minority. The leaders of the project becoming a minority at the Free University in Brussels, and its financial funder, the European Union, apparently believe in the Great Replacement theory, as their project is based exactly on the demographic assumptions of this theory. 36% of all children in Germany have a migration background, and while the indigenous European populations are decreasing because of low birth rates, the migrant populations are increasing, both due to immigration and higher birth rates. In addition to these developments in Europe, there are ominous signs outside of Europe. One such sign is the projected population growth in Africa and in the Middle East, the two main sources of immigration to Europe. Africa's population is expected to almost double by 2050, from currently 1.22 billion to 2.3 billion. As the graph shows, it is expected to continue to grow, at a high rate, until 2100. The population of the Middle East is expected to grow from the current 411 million to 678 million in 2050. Already now there is a huge migration pressure from these regions to Europe. Given the predicted population growth in these regions, we can expect this pressure only to grow. Until now, the European Union has shown itself extremely incapable and or unwilling to resist this pressure. Last but not least, the Pew Research Center report about Europe's growing Muslim population acknowledges, on page 43, the many uncertainties involved in projecting the growth of Muslim demographics in Europe. This, together with the fact that the demographic changes of the kind discussed here are practically irreversible, gives further justification for concerns about a great replacement. Thus, relying on assurances by critics of the Great Replacement theory like Melissa Rossi, Aylen du Crow and Landis Mckellar that there is nothing to worry about, that, as Mckellars states, the idea of a great replacement is easily discredited, would be foolish and dangerous for anyone who would like to preserve the identity of European countries into the future. Our conclusion is this: the demographic changes described by the Great Replacement theory are indeed happening. If policies as practiced in European countries remain as they are now, European indigenous populations will indeed become minorities in many places in Europe, within a few decades. And, in the not-too-distant future, Europe's population and culture will change beyond recognition. But there are other critics of the Great Replacement theory, those who accept that a great replacement is indeed happening, but who welcome its consequences. The next part of this series will look at their arguments.